So thanks everyone for joining our Lunch and Learn event for Together in Manzanar. I know that people are still coming in, so we'll wait a minute or two until we have uh, the majority of people joining. So, but bear with us for a bit. Just some logistical things. We will have a Q&A session at the end of our conversation. So as we go along go ahead and enter your questions there should be a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and go ahead and enter that whenever something comes up. And we'll get to as many of the questions as we can. So maybe we'll wait another few seconds. And yeah, as Nina in the background is helping us with the program, and she's in the chat. So go ahead and feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat if you're so inclined. So. But even though some people are still signing on, why don't we go ahead and get started? So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Lunch and Learn event today, which highlights a terrific new book called Together in Manzanar by Tracy Slater. It's one of a number of books we've seen in recent years from commercial presses that have looked at the Japanese incarceration story. And hers, I think, is really important in that it really looks at it from a distinctive angle. And I think that angle really highlights the absurdity of the exclusion incarceration policy, as we'll get into a little later. My name is Brian Niiya. I'm the content director here at Densho. Hope everyone's doing okay in these challenging times. It's been a while since we've done one of these events, even though there have been many books and films and other projects to highlight. So I hope we'll be able to do more of them in the coming months. So the format for the program is we're going to start with a presentation by Tracy, the 10, 12 minutes or so, and then we'll have a conversation for another 20, 25 minutes. Then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So as I said, feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A at any point, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Given that it's a lunchtime thing, we want to try to end right on the hour or even a little before to respect everyone's time. And yeah, thanks again for joining us. Let me now introduce Tracy. Tracy Slater is an American writer from Boston, living temporarily in Toronto, though her family is usually based in Japan, her husband's country. Her first book was an award-winning memoir titled The Good Shufu, Finding Love, Self, and Home on the Far Side of the World, which was published in 2015. Her articles and essays have been published in New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and many, many other places. Tracy holds a PhD in English and American literature from Brandeis University and taught for 10 years at various Boston area universities, as well as in men's and women's prisons throughout Massachusetts. You can learn more about Tracy at her website, tracyslater.com. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tracy to tell us about this new book. So welcome.
Thanks so much, Brian, and welcome everybody. Before I get started, I just want to say an absolutely huge thank you to Densho in general and to Brian in particular. It is not an exaggeration to say that I absolutely could not have written this book without either. His support has been incredible, and the unbelievable resources that are available on Densho's website for free for everybody also backed up or compiled so much of the research from my book. So I'm very grateful to both. I'll give a very brief intro into myself and why I wrote the book, because that's what people have been asking a lot about. I'm a Jewish American with no Japanese ancestry myself, although as Brian told you, I'm married to a Japanese man, a Japanese man from Japan, not Japanese American. And I came to the story after our son was born. He's the first Japanese American in our family. And I wondered about the intersection of our child's two ethnic heritages, Jewish American and Japanese American. And I came across the story of the Yonedas one day, just really from a Google search. And it really captivated me. And then the more I learned about them, the more I researched about them, the more it not just captivated me, but really like, almost like felt like it had me in its claws and I couldn't look away from it. And I just wanted to know their story and know more and more about it. And I knew if I really wanted that, then I would have to write it. And I feel really lucky that I was able to. Um, Particularly as a Jewish American who grew up on the East Coast of the US in a family that was deeply concerned with the occurrence and the history of the Nazi Holocaust, and in a school system that spent little to no time at all on the race-based forced removal and mass incarceration of the Japanese American citizens during World War II and Japanese and their family members, Japanese American residents. So that's what really captivated me and brought me to the book. Um, okay, I'll move to the next slide, which shows the Yoneda family. Here they are in Manzanar. Elaine Yoneda, who's a white Jewish woman, similar ethnic background, Ashkenazi Jewish to mine. And her husband, Karl Yoneda, Japanese American, both prominent leftist activists before the war, and their 3-year-old son, Tommy, who was incarcerated along with them in Manzanar concentration camp. And the book really uncovers two hidden histories. Neither of which has been told before in narrative nonfiction. And what I mean by narrative nonfiction is true. It's a true as close as possible to the truth as one can get through research, true rendition of history, fully researched and backed up by citations, but not necessarily written for a scholarly audience, but for a broader audience. There's a lot of citations and footnotes that might be interesting to scholars, but they're not in the text, they're at the end, so it can also be read as a narrative. The two hidden histories are, the first is the leftists across the camps. As I said, Karl and Elaine were prominent anti-fascist and labor activists before the war on the West Coast. And the story of leftists in Manzanar and across the camps in general, and the real struggle that many of them felt about how to support the Allied forces in their fight against fascism, which had long been a deep concern of the leftist community in the US and other places, how to support that Allied fight and the American war effort from inside an American concentration camp themselves, and whether or not protesting America's concentration camps would somehow harm the war effort. It's deeply unfortunate that I think that the leftist movement in the US, like much of the Jewish American community, I might add, made it clear that in their eyes, protesting the camps while they were happening would in fact hurt the effort against the Axis. And the book tells the story of the Yonedas' struggle with this kind of conflict, especially for Karl, who was Kibei, a Japanese American who had lived part of his life in Japan, but was a Japanese American citizen. And also some of the regrets that the Yonedas did and some regrets that they didn't have ideologically once the war passed. So that's one hidden history. The other hidden history is the one that I'm going to focus on today in a bit more in depth, which is the history of mixed race families across the camp. And this history was one shared by a greater number of incarcerees and their families than the history of leftists in the camp. And I thought I'd tell you a little bit about what the book uncovers in terms of how the US military and government tried to detect and police these families and how they tried to measure their so-called danger, tried to struggle and really reaching absurd heights, which we'll you'll see throughout the presentation, struggled mightily to kind of define and measure these families, and come up with policies which frequently shifted around mixed families in and across the camps. And by looking at this policy and the many different iterations and the government's rather absurd effort to do all of this, we can really see it exposes in a really robust and disturbing, but as I said, also quite absurd way, the racist underpinnings of the entire forced removal and mass incarceration of the West Coast Japanese American community and their families. This is important, I think, for anyone who still doubts the racist underpinnings of this part of our nation's history, that this was predicated purely on racism and not at all on military necessity, which is the sort of story and lie that the government told, and which unfortunately it seems a large number of Americans still do believe. A significant amount of Americans still believe that it was military necessity that underlay the forced removal and incarceration. And I think, frankly, there's probably a lot of white people in the United States who still believe this. And I hope that the book will bring white audiences into this story and into the story of the forced removal and incarceration in some way that some may have been either reluctant or uninterested because they couldn't see themselves or their families reflected in its history, at least from the perspective of incarcerees. Of course, there were plenty of white Americans who worked in the camps. So I hope this book is meaningful to people who already know the sort of deep resonance of this history, but also I hope it brings new people into the history in a way that they may not have imagined before. And before changing the slide, I'll just point out what the picture is of the Yonedas in Manzanar, along with two visitors. One on the far right is their fellow leftist. They refer to her frequently as their comrade, and their friend, Happy Brennan, who visited Manzanar. Visitors were allowed at sometimes, and sometimes were not allowed. But at this point in the summer, they were allowed. She visited Manzanar with Elaine's daughter, her white daughter, who you can see in the background, sort of fading into the desert a little bit, behind Karl and Elaine. Elaine had to leave this white daughter from her previous marriage. Karl was her second marriage. So her white daughter from her previous marriage, she had to leave her daughter behind with her white Jewish parents in LA and Boyle Heights when she went to Manzanar, to be with Karl and in great part to protect Tommy, who had some serious health issues and was only 3 years old. So that's what that picture is. So I'll move to the next slide, which is statistics of the in-camp mixed race families. Of course, these statistics can't encompass people like Joyce because they were not counted. The family members who stayed outside the camps, there was no way to count them. But we can logically assume that there were thousands of people in the same category as Joyce, given that historians estimate there are about 2,100 mixed race family members who were incarcerated. So there must have been many more who remained outside of camp, and although they were free, they, like the people in camp, suffered the trauma and long-term separation of being forcibly separated from their family members. You can see the other statistics here of the non-Japanese people with no Japanese ancestry who were in camp. The picture on the right is from the form that the government used to categorize incarcerees, and they used you'll see that they use Japanese, white, and other, which shows, and you'll see more as the presentation goes on, this sort of inability to understand ethnicity as anything other than white or Japanese, and then sort of other out in the ether somehow, which itself is sort of absurd and caused quite a lot of confusion, which I'll explain in a minute. Moving on to the next slide, what happened to mixed families during the forced removal and incarceration. Initially, in the initial stage during the forced removal, the task of categorizing and organizing these mixed family members fell mostly to social workers who worked at the civil control stations up and down the West Coast, registering people and giving them instructions for their being sent to camp. The social workers who worked on a part-time basis, they were hired, basically for this purpose. They initially had no instructions about how to deal with mixed race family members, so they made ad hoc decisions about who should be excluded, the government's term. So who could not stay on the West Coast, basically be excluded from the West Coast, who could be exempted from the exclusion or exempted from removal and forced incarceration, and what to do about non-Japanese family members who were facing separation from their Japanese spouses or their Japanese children, or mixed Japanese spouses or mixed Japanese children. So in the beginning, some families were encouraged to apply for what was called the Temporary Exemption Certificate for Mixed Race Family Group. The initial form was known as WDC PM8. And you'll see here a letter from a white woman married to a Japanese American man who applied to want to know what to do about her husband being forcibly removed and separated from her, and the Western Defense Command, the WDC, and the Wartime Civil Control Administration, the WCCA, they recommended to her, her name was Dorothy Nakamura, that she apply for a family exemption for one of these temporary exemption certificates. So that's what originally happened for Dorothy Nakamura. Her husband's name was George, so she's here as Mrs. George Nakamura. Other families faced immediate separation when they showed up at the civil control stations, and there was no uniform distinction among the two groups. It was just sort of whatever the social workers thought was they were supposed to do. And these family separations, one social worker described as, quote, the harsh necessity of breaking up a family. A very interesting book that looks at the role of these social workers, and from which I got this quote, is a book by Yosun Park. And I think maybe Nina can put it in the chat if people are interested, or you can contact me, and I can let you know the full citation. So anyway, this sort of ad hoc decision making and total lack of uniformity among what was happening to these mixed families, it obviously led to a lot of confusion, both among WCCA workers and the families themselves. And so on May 8th, 1942, all these exemptions were canceled. The head of the Western Defense Command, General John J. DeWitt, issued a memo, a directive that attempted to resolve the sort of ad hoc nature of these decisions and family separations, not to stop the family separations, but to prevent there being an ad hoc nature to the family separations. And this policy, this decision was communicated about 4 days later to all workers up and down the civil control stations. And DeWitt, in his memo, mandated that what he called, quote, Japanese evacuation cases involving intermarriage between Japanese and other races and their children would now be subject to the same fate as, quote, all persons of Japanese ancestry, whether of whole or part blood. So with that, any temporary exemptions or deferments, like the one that we saw previously for Dorothy Nakamura, any of those that had been given to mixed family members were also retroactively canceled. No more would be given out. Any that were given out that had been given out were retroactively canceled. And for the resulting separations, DeWitt declared that he would issue something called WDC Form PM7, which you can see on the right of the screen. It declared a non-Japanese spouse or parent may, quote, elect to accompany his or her Japanese ancestry spouse or child into an assembly or reception center. end quote. So the government euphemism for a concentration camp. So Form DCPM7, it might be a little hard to read because it's a little bit, I don't know if it's small on your screen, but it was called the request and waiver of of a non-excluded person, and it required non-Japanese family members to, quote, request the privilege of accompanying their spouse or their child to concentration camp and to waive the right to leave. And this is one place where the policy reaches an incredible level of absurdity. They had to sign that they would agree to, quote, conform in all respects as if a person of Japanese ancestry. So sort of on paper, you change your ethnicity and you change your carcerability. All the while at the very bottom of the form attesting that they had personally solicited this fate without persuasion or duress, which if you think about the duress of, seeing your children taken away from you and put in a camp really makes no sense. Um, that's what happened to the mixed families, even the ones who had initially been given an exemption. And for those who either couldn't or wouldn't go to camp, many people couldn't go to camp. They couldn't give up their livelihoods. Their entire family had already lost, if not everything, then much of their land and property and employment because of the part of the family that had to go to camp. So for those people who didn't or couldn't go to camp, they endured a family separation. So on the next slide, what if no Japanese relative would or could go to camp? What happened in this case, and we know this from a 1953 court case that was related to the Japanese American Claims Act, uh, recovering some compensation, not much, but some compensation from what had been given up during the forced removal. We know that the government said that where a non-Japanese mother was unable to accompany her part Japanese child, the child was sent to camp, to the assembly center or the concentration camp, basically, with their family or other relatives. And there is documentation of one control station social worker in Pasadena, California, who was involved in administering the separation of a white mother from her 19-month-old baby, who was sent to camp with its father and grandmother. I don't know what the gender of the child was. That wasn't in the records. But in the event that no father or Japanese relative was available to take the child, this court case showed that, quote, the policy apparently was to take the child and place it in an institution and later transfer it to the children's center. In other words, the orphanage at Manzanar, California. So the pictures here on the slide are two pictures from the Manzanar, again, euphemistically called Children's Village, the orphanage at Manzanar Camp. And this was the only orphanage across all the camps. So the Children's Village also held children who had been living in orphanages before the war, about 20 of whom were of multi-ethnic lineage. And in research for the book, I uncovered snippets of story of one little blonde-haired boy who had been in an orphanage for white children until the bombing of Pearl Harbor. He had never actually known that he was part Japanese until someone checked his file and alerted the army, and he was swiftly dispatched to Manzanar's orphanage, where he was joined by two teenage girls who had lived with their white grandmother and also had lacked any knowledge of their own mixed Japanese ancestry. In this case, ostensibly, the grandmother was either unwilling or unable to go to camp, and so the girls were forcibly relocated to the Children's Village alone, as all the children there were. So, moving on to the next slide. Despite the ruse that all the people in camp were either Japanese or, quote, as if Japanese, it became clear throughout the spring and summer of 1942, that there was a growing number of mixed race people within the camps and also of some non-Japanese people in mixed families. And this caused some consternation, particularly among the government. So on July 3rd, 1942, DeWitt approved something called it was called the mixed marriage policy. Sometimes it was called the mixed blood policy. I usually refer to it here as the mixed marriage policy, but it's referred to interchangeably throughout different documents and memos in the records. It was written either by or at the direction of Karl Benditson, who DeWitt was Benditson's direct boss, and Benditson was the director of the WCCA, of the Wartime Civil Control Administration. He was the head. Its objective, the mixed marriage, mixed blood policy's objective, according to DeWitt, was to, quote, protect mixed blood children and adults from a Japanese environment. Benditson's sort of take on the purpose of the policy was that for mixed race family members, their Americanization, he wrote, and their, quote, awkward social position was making life in the Japanese centers, as he referred to it, a, quote, trying and often humiliating experience. The trying and humiliating experience for everybody else in the, quote, centers was not something he addressed. So the policy went into de facto effect about 9 days later, when it was communicated to all camp managers, which you can see here on the slide, a memo communicating it. And the policy mandated along various gender and race lines who could be released and returned to the restricted area, meaning the West Coast, meaning home for them, who could be released only under the condition of resettlement east, so not return home, and who must remain imprisoned. And the basic breakdown was that a mixed marriage family composed of a Japanese or Japanese American husband, his white wife, and their what the policy calls unemancipated mixed children, so there are minor children with them in camp, could be released, but only on the condition that they would not go home, that they would resettle east outside of the West Coast. Families composed of a white US citizen husband, his Japanese or Japanese American wife, and their unemancipated mixed children could be released and returned to the West Coast, as long as the, quote, environment of the family could be proven to be Caucasian, which I'll discuss a little more in the next slide, but which is as meaningless and crazy as it sounds. Otherwise, if they could not prove that their environment had been Caucasian, they would have to resettle outside the restricted area or remain imprisoned. The initial policy also said adult individuals of mixed blood who were citizens of the US could be released and return to the West Coast, return home, if also their environment could be, before the war, before they were forcibly removed, if they could prove that their home environment had been Caucasian. Otherwise, they'd have to resettle east or remain imprisoned. And spouses in mixed marriage families with no minor children with them in camp had no recourse at all to apply for release, other than those available to any other inmate that became available as the incarceration, the war went on, unless one of them was serving in the U.S. Armed Forces, and then they could apply for release. Didn't mean they would get it, but they could apply. So you can really see in this policy the obsession that the WCCA and when the War Relocation Authority, the WRA, took over the camps and also started administering the policy in the camps, when both the obsession that both the WCCA and the WRA had with race, with measuring it, with defining it, and with how it defined the very nature of each citizen. And it's an obsession and an absurdity that became only more apparent with each iteration of the policy, of which there were many. I'll move to the next slide. The iterations followed the endless problems that arose with the policy. The two probably most frequent problems had to do with what to do about family members who were not white or mixed white. It seemed initially the government didn't even think about race other than white or Japanese. And there were many people in mixed families who had no family members who would have counted as white to the WCCA or WRA. Some people were married to people from the Philippines. Some people were married to people from Mexico. People married to people of Chinese descent. So that was one major confusion. And then another is, what exactly is a Caucasian environment? The the workers at the administrators at the camps could not answer that question because obviously there is no answer, but that they tried to figure out what the WCCA and WRA meant by that. So on July 17th, just 5 days after the policy was initially announced, the WCCA provided a supplement that allowed the potential release, but not the return home, the potential release to resettle outside the restricted area of 2 new family groups. Those composed of a Japanese or non-Japanese alien husband, not a US citizen, but a citizen of a friendly nation, and their minor children, and Caucasian mothers, white mothers who were citizens of a friendly nation, and her mixed children. But the caveat was her Japanese or Japanese American husband could not be released with them, so he would have to remain imprisoned. So the different iterations of the policy can be still a little bit hard to track because there's not a file that announces sort of in the archives every single iteration, but we can look through the files and see evidence of the iterations. One piece of evidence is a November 21st letter from Karl Bennett, November 21st, 1942, letter from Karl Bennetson to a military colleague mentioning another iteration of the policy that went into effect by then, establishing 2 new parameters. One was that mixed race adults would now be eligible for release only if they had 50% or less Japanese blood. And a Caucasian US citizen wife could now be released and could return home to the West Coast area with her minor children, but only if her Japanese or Japanese American husband were, quote, dead or long separated from the family. So those are some of the confusions and iterations. But as I said, the big confusion, which I mentioned on this next slide, the Caucasian environment. So throughout the mixed marriage policies, different iterations and transformations, as the concentration camp managers compiled data about which mixed family members might be eligible to apply for freedom, they struggled with how to define, much less prove, the Caucasian environment that their former prisoners had lived within their homes that they were forcibly removed from. So sometimes they focused on the language spoken in the former home, the percentage of friends who were Japanese or not, the type of food that the family had eaten, but often they just deferred to the vague category of appearance, frequently claiming that, for instance, fully Japanese wives somehow took on the ethnic appearance of their non-Japanese husbands, or perhaps looked Asian, but not really Japanese. One camp manager reported about a Japanese woman born in Japan, married to a Caucasian. This case was Japanese American woman married to a white man. In supporting her application for release, his justification was her appearance is that of a Chinese person and her mannerism is more Americanized, whatever that means, which you can see on the Bettine Lawson document. It's on the left side of my screen. I hope I'm saying these sides that it's the same side that you guys are seeing. If not, I'm sorry, but it's the Bettine Lawson document. And then on the other side, the Japanese wife of a U.S. Army enlistee from the Philippines, camp administrator supported her application for release because she did not appear to be Japanese, somehow magically having facial characteristics more nearly typifying persons of Spanish descent, as if she had somehow taken on the appearance of the colonizers who had originally colonized her husband's homeland. And another official, the document doesn't appear here, but another official supported his motion for release of 2 mixed race inmates by claiming that they were definitely Caucasian in appearance and therefore, would not be a threat or cause problems in the greater free population. So more absurdity. So the results of the mixed marriage policy. According to the final report, which is a document that was submitted under John DeWitt's name, but assumed to have been written by Karl Bennetson, it was submitted in early 1943. Well, it was submitted in mid-1943, but anyway, it documents that in early 1943, the WCCA had granted release to 460 5 persons of Japanese ancestry, and you can see that in the little red circle, they'd been allowed to return to the West Coast restricted area. Among these were 290 mixed blood children, 34 mixed race parents, 71 Japanese mothers, and 68 mixed adults who had no children, but presumably had 50% or more white blood and had somehow proven that their environment had been Caucasian before the war. And you can also track results after the final report was released through the media. Occasionally, you can find media reports throughout 1943 and beyond. This clip from the LA Times, July 1943, shows WRA, the head of the WRA at that point, Dylan Meyer, explaining why there were some mixed race Japanese people who appeared in California, explaining that they had been released as part of the mixed marriage policy with the full approval of the Army. By September 1943, the Western Defense Command counted just over 554 people who had been released through the policy and were living on the West Coast. This number would exclude a modest portion of people who had been freed but had been able to settle east. And so this left approximately 1,300 intermarried Japanese and 300 people of mixed ancestry still imprisoned in the camps, many of whom endured long-term traumatic separation from their relatives outside, as of course did their relatives endure that same separation. Which brings me back to the last slide, the Yonedas. I want to point again in closing in this picture to Joyce, hidden here as if disappearing into the desert. Again, she's the white daughter, the young teenager that Elaine had to leave behind when she went into Manzanar. And Joyce is a daughter for whom Manzanar represents a kind of unique breaking point in that it was the last time she would ever again live with her mother or brother. I won't say more, leave a little bit of incentive to read the book about what happens to the Yoneda family. But despite Benditson's justification that I mentioned earlier, that the mixed marriage policy, his justification for the mixed marriage policy, which was that for families with white or mixed white members, their quote Americanization and their awkward social position made life trying and humiliating in the camps, what he called centers. Despite this justification for the policy or explanation for it, for the Yonedas themselves, they actually encountered more strife in the camps because of their politics, not because of their race, at least in the records that were left behind. Although, of course, Elaine and Tommy's ethnic background clearly intensified the family's ambivalence about whether or not doing anything to criticize the government, the American government, while they were in an American concentration camp, their ambivalence about whether that would in any way harm the Allied war effort, because of course, their fear of what would happen if the if the Axis won, as they heard more and more sort of really frightening reports about what was happening in Axis occupied and German occupied Europe to the Jewish community that was being eradicated. But so to me, the story of Together in Manzanar and of the Yonedas as a mixed family in camp is one not only of a mixed family, of the mixed race family, but also of a family whose experiences highlight the many different ways that the entire camp population was mixed, racially, generationally, ideologically, economically. So the Yonedas really stand to me as an example of the multi-heterogeneity of the entire camp population. And so their story is a direct and really crucial, I think, rebuke to the lie upon which the camps were based. The lie that all people of Japanese ancestry were just sort of part and parcel of one, indivisible, homogenous group who in their very biology showed some sort of danger for national security, and thus it was a military necessity to remove and incarcerate them all. And so many aspects of the Yoneda story really challenge that lie. And this is one more reason that I hope that as many people as possible can learn their story and learn about the sort of broader lessons that it tells about our history. So.
Great. Thank you so much, Tracy. And yeah, please enter your questions in the chat as you think of them. One I want to address right away because it's just a straightforward number. Annette Beauchamp asked, "Could you please repeat the number that were released?" I assume she means the number of people from mixed families that were released.
Yeah, I can repeat them. And then if you want me to write it down, feel free to contact me and I'll write it down for you. But um, so, well, so people were released throughout the war, actually, throughout the incarceration. But by early 1943, there were 465 people of Japanese ancestry that had been allowed to return to the West Coast.
And
These
this would include Japanese quote unquote spouses of non-Japanese and mixed race, people of mixed Japanese ancestry, right?
only Japanese mothers who were
Okay.
married.
So
Yeah,
does not include people of mixed race ancestry.
it does. Sorry. So within this 465 people, there were 290 mixed blood children,
Okay.
34 mixed race parents. So they were there could have been some Japanese ancestry parents who were in a mixed marriage themselves, but had 50% or more Caucasian blood, I guess. 34 sorry, I said 34 mixed race parents, 71 Japanese mothers, and 68 mixed adults without children. So that's by early 1943. And then by September 1943, the count was just over 554 people released through the policy and living on the West Coast. I don't have the breakdown of the different categories within that, like who was a mixed race adult, who was a mother in a mixed marriage with their mixed kids. So that left, if we take those numbers from the original, about 2,100 people who historians think were incarcerated at one point or another in the camps. That does include Japanese people who were in mixed marriages, that 2,100, but it leaves approximately 1,300 intermarried Japanese and 300 people of mixed ancestry imprisoned in the camps, at least by September 1943. And the records are a little spotty but
Right.
that's so. And again, feel free to contact me if you want any information about these numbers or information about the documents from which I got the numbers.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I, as you're talking through this story, I find myself almost chuckling at it because I think we both used the term absurd or absurdity a number of times, and it really is. It just really brings out
Yeah.
all the contradictions and knots that the officials have to tie themselves into to justify various parts of this policy. And it just really, yeah, it just really brings out the absurdity of the whole enterprise. So yeah,
Yeah,
that
and
really,
racism. It's interesting how the policy in mixed race policy actually helps highlight the racism. But anyway,
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we only have a little bit of time. We'll get to some of the questions from the audience, but one thing I wanted to ask you about is just the style of the book. Uh, it's written, in a very much a novelistic style. It's kind of chronological. And I was wondering, as you compiled the research, if you considered other ways of telling the story, whether fictionalizing it, centering it more on the writings of the Yonedas, introducing other main characters. How did that process go in terms of how you decided to tell the story?
so I did not think of fictionalizing it for two reasons. One, I'm not a fiction writer, so I didn't think I had the skill to do that. But also what I understand about fiction, and yeah, so my understanding of being a fiction writer, and again, I'm not a fiction writer, so this is what I understand from talking to fiction writers, um, is, that you sort of take your own understanding of a situation and kind of create a world around it. And I didn't feel comfortable as someone who did not have any family connection to the American concentration camps. I didn't feel comfortable fictionalizing uh, a, version of the history because I didn't. I wanted as much as possible to try to kind of avoid assumptions or blind spots. I'm sure I didn't avoid them completely because I'm sure I'm made some mistakes or it wasn't perfect in the book, but I felt like if I had this the strictures of nonfiction and the sort of goal and sort of rules of following only in every moment what I could find documentation for, and then what I could not find any documentation contradicting that documentation. If I followed only that, or if I followed only that, I would have the least chance of sort of projecting uh, my own sort of biases or whatever. And in terms of the chronology, I talked to a couple of people about the story at first. I had an agent for my first book who didn't think I was going to be able to sell this book. And in fairness, I presented it slightly differently. But I talked to her, and I was really so committed to this book that then I said, well, I think I need to find another agent. I'll like risk not having an agent. And thankfully I found another. I was really super lucky. Um, but I talked to her and I talked to just a couple of other people, and everybody was that I talked to initially was really grabbed by the part of the story where Elaine has to choose between leaving behind her white daughter to go with her younger child. I was also grabbed by that, but I was also grabbed by a number of other different aspects of the story too, as equally grabbed. But it seemed like most of the people that I talked to were like, that's the thing that first really pulled them in. And because I knew that I wanted this to be as true as humanly possible, like as backed up as humanly possible, as much of a faithful rendition of history as humanly possible. But I wanted it to read like a novel. Like I wanted it to be a story that you get totally caught up in, because I was totally caught up in the history. Um, I wanted to start with something that would hopefully pull people in, and that was why I started there.
In doing all this research, I'm sure there was a lot of you have a lot more than you could include. What was there anything in particular that you had to leave out that was really hard to leave out?
Yeah, there was a lot of stuff about Carl Benenson who I don't talk about that much. I mean, I certainly reference him in this presentation, but he's a bigger figure in the book. And I had a lot more about Carl Benenson actually even than made it into the book. He's fascinating to me because he was also Jewish American, who also Ashkenazi Jewish. So that means his family, like my family, like Elaine's family, escaped from Europe well before World War II, but escaped from the pogroms and the anti-Semitism, and moved to the U.S. as immigrants, and then future generations became Jewish Americans. And he, in the incredibly racist environment and anti-Semitic environment of the American military at the time, which the book goes into somewhat, he hid his Jewish identity. I don't think he would have been successful had he not. I don't think he would have been successful in the army had he not. Let's say that. I don't know what his life would have been like otherwise. But um, and the fact that he sort of was able to change his identity sort of on paper, but he changed the spelling of his name, and he rewrote his bio, and he had this very sort of on paper way of presenting himself. And then he took that, and it seemed like he then applied this ability to tweak the representation of someone's identity to this whole policy about a whole other group of people. So I was really fascinated by that, and by the way his story both resembles Elaine's and also really, really diverges from it, particularly in the way that Elaine is someone who I think really was able eventually, although she struggled at times, but she was really able to encompass the many contradictory aspects of her identity. She was able to, and she was also lucky enough to be able to. And he wasn't, to clearly disastrous results, at least socially, in terms of where it led him. So there was a lot more about him. I do have a fair amount in the book, but there was a lot more about his story that I ended up cut out.
And there is a really good biography of Ben Detson by Clancy Clark DeNevers also, which delves into a lot of those issues. He's sometimes the villains have really compelling stories as well.
Yeah.
Let's go to a couple of the questions from the audience. Harley Rosnow asks, how does the history in this book help us understand what's happening in the world and the US today?
Such a good question. Well, there are a lot of there's so many things happening in the world today that are upsetting, and there's so much in the book that's upsetting. So, but I'm gonna just take a guess that that the questioner, I'm sorry, I think the person's first name was Harley. Sorry if I got it wrong. That the questioner is asking about the camps, concentration camps that are being set up now for categories of people. Um, so just that in itself is a really important resonance, I think, and a scary resonance. Dealing with people with no compassion and with no understanding of their a true understanding of the sort of multifaceted aspect of someone's background and identity, I think is behind the story that I tell, and also some of the stories that we see happening today. Um, and but the one important difference that I also see between what's happening, horrible things that are happening with the immigrant community in the United States today, and the kind of witch hunting against the immigrant community, is, that I think it's important to remember that two-thirds of the people, of the 120,000 people who were rounded up and incarcerated in the West Coast Japanese American forced removal were US citizens. And I know that there are US citizens that are being caught up in the immigration raids today. Um, but I think it sounds like among some people and among the media, there's some concern about, not having this happen to US citizens. It shouldn't be happening to anybody, but, and that lack of concern about US citizens and the lack of ability to understand Japanese Americans as US citizens, even though they were US citizen, like any of us are US citizens. That I think is one place that it's different. Or that there are some differences.
Mhm.
So it's a really
Okay.
important question.
Yeah, thank you. Let's go to one by Andrea Eschen next. Could you please describe your research process, sources, visits to camps, national historic sites, interviews with Yoneda's granddaughter, and difficulty getting the sources? Anything that sticks out as particularly challenging?
Yeah. Well, I will say that if it's the Andrea Ashton that I think it is, she and I were in a historical writing class together that actually really helped me with the proposal. So I started some of the research in that class. Um, well, there was a lot in that question. So I think in my answer, I will focus on the part where you asked about the Yoneda's descendants. I was super lucky to find um, the Yoneda's granddaughter. Tommy's the Tommy was the 3-year-old, Tommy's daughter, the Yoneda's granddaughter, and I was able to have multiple interviews with her, and she was this incredible combination of really enthusiastic and so open and so supportive, and she sent me, private family stuff, and um, but she also was completely hands off in terms of what I wrote, and she didn't never said like I need to approve it or whatever. So um, I was incredibly lucky to have found her, and to have been able to get information beyond what's sort of available in the public archives, and to do interviews with her. And also, as I said, lucky that she also just was really generous in trusting me to kind of tell the story as I found it. So um, I mean, the research was like endless, so and I loved it. I loved the research process. I could go on forever, but I don't. Should I stop there or should I?
Well, there are many other questions, so
Okay, okay. Let me just
why
say
don't
one
we?
last thing, and that
Yeah,
is
yeah.
that before because I want to. Do you want to? I know I went on for a while in the presentation. There was so much research, and there is so much research available on the Densho side. I know I said that in the beginning, but it's unbelievable. So for some reason you haven't gone to the Densho site to do research, it is like this treasure trove. So I did so much of my research I found through Densho also. Okay.
Okay. Probably just have time for a couple more. let's see. Grace Ibarra, it was my understanding that the larger Manzanar community did not want their children to play with mixed race children at the children's village. Can you comment on this?
Oh, I can't. That's fascinating. And I don't know if that understanding came from documentation or commentary that was more focused on the children's village or on mixed race families. I mean, I do know that there's some evidence that there's some documentation from mixed race people, not in children's village, but from mixed race people who, or people in mixed race marriages who reported being sort of ostracized by their own family for marrying someone from another ethnic background. Karl and Elaine themselves, not in Manzanar, confronted a lot of pressure from their own families for it was a time when interracial marriage was just not widely accepted. I
Right.
don't know about the Manzanar village part, but I do know that there's a fantastic book on Manzanar Children's Village that I would imagine would have reported something about that if there was documentation for it. And now I cannot remember the name of it, but it's cited in the book. And feel free to contact me and I will look it up. I will find it. So yeah. And I know Tommy at times endured some teasing, but if you read the book, you'll see that was a lot of that was sort of directed to Elaine. Um, so
Okay. And I think maybe we have time for just one more. Let's go with Joya Hart. Congrats on getting published. So important to have this accounting of this facet of the JA history. I believe that your Jewish heritage makes speaking up about painful and emotional aspects of life has an influence. JA people are not frequently willing to speak about any uncomfortable topics. Can you speak about this?
yeah. Uh, well, um, I mean, it's true that I can speak for East Coast, the East Coast Jewish community that I grew up in. Love talking about, trauma and your therapist and, your whatever. So that's true for my family and my background. I don't the people of Japanese descent that I am closest to are not Japanese American. They're Japanese. So I know my husband's totally opposite. Like he doesn't, he would like does not understand the concept of like, spewing he'll do it within his family. He'll do it with me and our kiddo, but he won't like talk to people he doesn't know about like some internal experience. So yeah. Uh, I definitely have different boundaries, and I think some of it is probably related to me being to the cultural tradition that I grew up in. So that's an interesting question. Both
Okay.
Carl and Elaine were very open, so um, even though he was Japanese American.
Right, right. And maybe we can just end with what you would like your readers, if anything, in particular specific, to take away from this book.
I guess, well, what I'd like the book to do, one of the things I'd like the book to do is, as I said earlier, is to bring in audiences who might not have been able to see themselves in the incarceration and forced removal. So that's one thing that does feel really important to me as an American, as this incredible part of our history that needs to be remembered and retold um, by everyone. And I guess the other thing in terms of individual readers is, as I said earlier, I think briefly, Elaine was someone who both had the ability and the privilege to inhabit and embrace so many different, not just different parts of her identity, but really contradictory parts. Like she was a leftist, but she didn't want to agitate against an American concentration camp when she was in it. She was a feminist. If you read the book, you'll see she was a feminist, but she didn't. She was like totally into clothes and shoes, which is a contradiction that I myself embrace. And she, was this incredibly devoted mother who, in some ways, would do anything for her son, and yet she left behind her daughter. So I think to be a human in this world is what I've understood so far in my, 57 years of life is that you have to, that to be a human in many different situations involves being able to accept and in our best moments maybe embrace, being able and also being lucky enough to be able to embrace many different aspects of our identity. And I think seeing someone else struggle with that and in such a intense situation is both fascinating, but also like maybe just makes you feel a little less alone in a way. So in that way, I feel like it's a real human story, the Yonedas story, and I would hope that it would bring some sort of recognition and interest and maybe even solace in some unexpected way to readers. So
Great. Thank you so much, Tracy. And thanks everyone for joining us. We've about come to the end of our time, and we want to be respectful for everyone's time. It's a terrific book, I think great for people who don't know this much about the story, as well as for people who know the story well. Really compelling narrative, a page turner. Together at Manzanar. Thanks so much, Tracy. Can people reach you through your website?
yeah, you can reach me through my website.
Okay.
My social media is there as well.
Okay.
And I have a list of resources too that I didn't get a chance to go over that if anyone wants about other aspects of the story, and especially descendants of the camps, I'm happy to give that to people too.
Great. Thanks so
Thank
much. And yeah, have a great rest of your day, everyone.
you. Yeah. Bye. Thanks.
Mm.